NUS Middle East Institute, Professor Ting Ting, Dean, School of Business, SUSS. Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, a very good afternoon and a very warm welcome to the event. My name is Stephen Ho and I shall be your host this afternoon. And I'm very excited to welcome all of you to the launch of the ME, also known as Middle East 101 series that is jointly organized. It's actually jointly organized by SUSS DBAC. Now, DBAC stands for the Doctor of Business Administration Community. The DBA program, or Doctor of Business Administration in SUSS, is a very unique program that started in 2019. And now we count amongst us more than 100 alumni and students. And it draws from a very distinguished field of business owners and professionals across many industries. And our students come from various parts of ASEAN. And this is a very unique program because all classes are simultaneously held in both Chinese and English. And of course, we also have NUS Middle East Institute. And this is a very exciting 6-lecture series that we have specially curated for very busy working professionals like all of you here. And it's really nice to see all of you on a Wednesday afternoon at about 5 o'clock. But no worries, we'll make it worth your while. Not only will you be very intellectually stimulated, we have provided nice drinks, wine, and food after. So not only will you get to enjoy intellectual stimulation, we will make sure that you also have very nice appetite afterwards. So maybe a very quick introduction about this series. ME 101 series is a flagship series that is organized by the Middle East Institute. And for this time around, we are having 6 in all. And the theme of this series, we like to call this Navigating the New Middle Eastern Landscape. I think there's a renewed interest in the Middle East. Apart from the headlines hogging the news on a daily basis about the conflicts there, there are a lot of interesting developments, both economically, socially, and politically in the region. So today, we are very privileged to have very distinguished speakers, as mentioned earlier, as well as Dr. Clemens Che, who will be bringing us through a short lecture on the Middle East. Without further ado, I would like to invite onto stage Professor Robbie Goh to give his opening remarks. Professor Goh.
Thank you very much, Stephen. And on behalf of SUSS, it is my great pleasure to welcome all the participants, distinguished guests, our speaker, to this series. I'll keep my comments brief. I just wanted to say that as SUSS is a relatively young university, only 7 years in existence as one of our autonomous universities, I have to say that so far we've tended to focus regionally on ASEAN, China, and India. With good reason, because these are important, very, very important regions, and also because you have to start somewhere with the focus, right? But it's well time to expand, and very, very important that our regional and our disciplinary knowledge base should be expanded. We are used to thinking in terms of big global powers. In fact, it was you may be familiar with the 18th, 19th century Austrian statesman, Prince Metternich, who is credited with the saying, he was the ambassador to France, among other things, and he's credited with the saying, when France sneezes, Europe catches a cold. And that sort of emphasized the importance of France to Europe at that point in time. His saying has since been adapted. After World War II, the saying was, when America sneezes, the whole world catches a cold. And of course, in recent years, it has been said that if China sneezes, the whole world catches a cold. What I wanted to say is that, and earlier Stephen said that there's been a renewed interest in the Middle East. From my point of view, it should not be a renewed interest. It should have been a continuing interest. Partly because the region is so important and also so changeable, so event-filled. But also because we live now in a very, very interconnected world where it's no longer just one dominant region or one dominant power that influences everybody. We might say that now, wherever there's a big sneeze, the rest of the world can catch a cold. So a little anecdote, personal anecdote, and an anecdote from academia. We always think of academia as somehow insulated from all these real world, real politic events. Academics read about them, they may write about them, but they don't actually live out these experiences as well. Well, the recent events in the Gaza region have proven otherwise. Obviously, conflicts and tensions there are not new, but I think it's the first time that the diffusion of effects the ripples have been reached so far. So even in academia, for example, as some of you may know, many of the universities around the world have seen students demonstrating and protesting. Even in Singapore, this is carefully monitored and carefully guided so that it may not be so evident. But even in Singapore, the university students are quite worked up about this issue and taking sides. So it's not just the big powers. Obviously, the big powers have been divided. Their alignments, their sort of loyalties have been affected. But even in the universities, among the students, right? And you may probably be aware as well that one of the ripples hit the president of Harvard, Claudine Gay, who as a sort of a knock-on effect was asked to resign her position just about a year into her presidency. And also the president of UPenn had a similar sort of fate. Yeah, I won't go to all the details. You probably know about that as well, but it was at least indirectly related to the events in the Gaza, right? And on a personal note, my son, who was in Colombia at the time, couldn't finish his exams, or rather his exams had to be rescheduled and rearranged, and he couldn't convocate as well, yeah, because of the events over there as well. And his mother and I were worrying about his personal safety because he had to go through the Colombia demonstrations, which were quite aggressive, among the more aggressive in the US universities. So just a personal anecdote about the interconnectedness, which I think is true to say is a lot more intertwined these days than it was, say, even 15, 20 years ago. So the point is that our world has become highly interconnected, and because of things like social media, complex financial instruments, travel and people movements, logistics, and other factors. So in such an environment, for institutions and businesses to thrive, our knowledge horizon has to be interregional and interdisciplinary. We need to be aware of major developments, not just in the so-called world powers, in other countries and regions as well. And we need to focus not just on economics and finance, but also on politics, international relations, culture, history, public health, as COVID will remind us, and other areas of study. So the SUSS DBAC and NUS MEI lecture series is a very timely and welcome development as far as I'm concerned. I encourage our DBAC's community, DBA community, as well as the rest of the SUSS community to take advantage of the analyses and insights that the lecture series provides. I will say also that when I was in NUS as the Dean of FASS, I used to enjoy the working papers that came from MEI. Even when I was busy, I couldn't read the whole paper. I would at least read the very useful executive summary at the beginning, and I picked up a lot from that as well. Special thanks, of course, to Chairman Mr. Bilahari Kausikan for helping create this series, and also for today's speaker, Dr. Clemens Che, who will kick off this series. My thanks also to the DBAC, particularly Stephen King Song, and to my School of Business colleagues, Dean Ting Ting, Dr. Wang Yue, for helping to make this happen. So I wish all of you a very, very productive session and then a good networking after this. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Prof. Go. And again, on a slightly personal note as well, Middle East has a very special place in my heart. So I was much younger then. And the reason why I mentioned renew is because I was trying to catch up with some of my lost time. Spent times traveling the whole region from UAE, United Arab Emirates, Saudi, Qatar, Oman, Bahrain, and so on and so forth. So very excited now hear from the latest. And of course, it now gives me great pleasure and privilege to invite on stage Mr. Bilahari Kausikan, Chairman of NUS MEI, to give his welcome remarks.
Thank you, Stephen. I first met in the Middle East, actually, 100 years ago. Young, he's not that young. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for taking time off on a Wednesday evening to attend this event. We have held something called Middle East 101 for quite a number of years. But this is the first time we have specially focused it for an audience like you. Normally, our audience is a general one. Now we have an audience from the SUSS Business School PhD program and those who have graduated. And I must tell you, you have considerably raised the level of the audience just by being here. So thank you. My job is not to go too much into substance, but to welcome you, which I've just done, but let me try to set the broad framework for the topic of this series, navigating the new Middle Eastern landscape. When we think about the Middle East, in generally, we think most naturally about geopolitics, about war, about rivalry a bit between states in the region, rivalry among great powers, about war. And today, when we think about the Middle East, we think most naturally about Palestine and the war in Gaza, which, as the Provost has pointed out, is a highly emotional issue, not just in the Middle East, but throughout the world. However, I'm going to make a point that is somewhat counterintuitive. I'm not denying the emotional aspect of the war in Gaza and the humanitarian aspect of the war in Gaza, which of course has extracted a horrific cost. Not just the war, but the events leading up to it, the terrorist attack of 7 October. And these are all important issues. But at the same time, there are much more consequential issues that we should also focus on. And I think one of the purposes of this course is to draw your attention to these issues which do not draw enough attention in the media, for example, than they really deserve. Right? Actually, even from a geopolitical point of view, the Palestinian issue, despite its huge humanitarian costs, despite the emotions it has aroused, has been steadily overshadowed by other geopolitical events since the 1980s. And the most important geopolitical event that has gradually eclipsed in sheer geopolitical logic the Palestinian issue is, of course, the Iranian Revolution of 1979. That revolution was seen as an existential threat by many of the Sunni Arab monarchies, because it was not just a question of it being a Shia revolution, perhaps much more threatening to these Shia monarchies. It was a Republican revolution. It overthrew a monarch. And that was probably even as threatening, at least as threatening. And the effects of that was accentuated by the 2003 American invasion of Iraq and its overthrow of Saddam Hussein. That effectively removed the only regional balance to Iran, Saddam's Iraq. Because of this shift in geopolitical focus, the Palestinian issue, while still attracting a lot of attention in the domestic politics of all the Arab monarchies, from a pure geopolitical view, declined in salience. Iran, it did not pose any kind of existential threat, any of these monarchies, in a way that they perceived Iran to pose a threat. And that, of course, was reinforced by the hard fact that many of them had fought and lost 3 wars against Israel. And after first Egypt and then Jordan normalized diplomatic relations with Iran, it became very much a diplomatic issue rather than a real geopolitical issue. Something take up in the UN, something you talk about, and it became a domestic political issue because your populations are still extremely roused up by it and have to be managed. I'll give you one small statistic, right, that will show the difference in focus. The Gaza war to date has caused something like more than 40,000 casualties, civilian and military. And I'm not counting the Israeli casualties, both from the terrorist attack and the soldiers that died. These are just Palestinians. And that's, of course, horrific and a humanitarian catastrophe. But the Iran-Iraq war of 8 years, which from 1980 to 1988, cost something between 1 and 2 million military and civilian casualties. We don't know actually the exact number, but that's the rough ballpark. And Iraq was supported by all the Arab monarchies in a way at a level that they have never supported Palestine. All this was reinforced by the 2011 Arab Spring, which again posed an existential threat to the Arab monarchies. By and large, they weathered the Arab Spring much better than other Arab countries because they drew upon traditional sources of loyalty and so on. And equally important, don't forget, they had the resources. Buy off, because the Arab Spring was primarily precipitated, I think, by the economic failure of many of these countries. These countries are rich. That does not mean they're economically successful. Those are two different issues. So they responded wisely by not that the immediate response was to buy off the population, but the long-term response where they began to take reform of their economies much more seriously. And that, I think, is the most consequential development in the long term for the Middle East. The way was led by the UAE, Qatar, Oman, but it really became of potential global political consequence when Saudi Arabia began to, under the leadership of the Crown Prince and now Prime Minister, Mohammed bin Salman, to also take reform very seriously. At the end of the day, the other Gulf states are kind of small economies. They're important, but they're small. What happens in Saudi Arabia has potentially an impact on the entire Muslim world, everywhere, particularly in Southeast Asia. And you may or may not know this, Southeast Asia has more Muslims than the Middle East. Reform is not just economic, because economic reform has to rest on a foundation of social cultural reform. And what is happening in Saudi Arabia in the role of women, in the way, and in the Gulf generally, in the role of women, in the way Islam is being conceived and practiced. Some of this, at least they are attempting to reorient the way Islam is being conceived and practiced. In general, moving it from the public sphere, potentially of great consequence, as I said, not just to the region, but to the whole world. And of course, the reform projects, the projects that are intended to catalyze reform, particularly in Saudi Arabia, have great potential economic consequences, not just for the region, but for other countries whose expertise can be tapped in. But reform also, although it is primarily economic, social, cultural, has a geopolitical impact. Saudi Arabia is not a small country. It's a big country. Apart from its significance in Islam, it is potentially a big country. It is potentially the only balancer to, if it develops its capabilities. More than that, it has reinforced what I've been talking about, how new political perceptions of salience of particular issues have shifted. Because in this reform effort, Palestine, however emotional an issue it may be, is inconsequential. But Israel is not inconsequential. Israel's technology, Israel's expertise, and Israel's military capabilities. And that is why, despite the strong emotions aroused by the Palestinian issue and the war in Gaza, no Arab member of the Abraham Accords has left it. They wring their hands in despair, they shout, they scream, but they all have left. And just a small factoid, when the war began, all the Western airlines immediately suspended their flights to Israel. The two Middle Eastern airlines that flew to Israel, which is Air Dubai and Etihad, did not stop. Recently, after Iran made threatening noises, again, Western airlines suspended it, flying the Middle Eastern airlines. Well, Iran is not going away. Therefore, I think it is only a matter of time, not whether, but when Saudi Arabia too will join the Abraham Accords. They will, of course, need to see some progress or some semblance of progress on the Palestinian issue to give them the political cover to do so, but it's not beyond imagination. It's not going to happen tomorrow or next week, but in the next few years. And in the meantime, Saudi cooperation with Israel continues, including defense and security cooperation. You may recall that in April, after the Israelis attacked the Saudi embassy and killed several senior people, Saudi Arabia, in retaliation, launched 300 missiles at Israel. None hit no significant target. The only casualty was one young Bedouin girl. And there was some minor damage to an Israeli airbase. Almost all the missiles were shot down, not just by Israel, US, UAE, and so on, but with the help of Jordan, and although it was not announced, but it's well known, Saudi Arabia too. And this is a very simple reason for this. One reason I've already told you, Israel can potentially play a big role. Its technology, its management skills in these reform efforts. But more important, Israel brings clout to what is in effect an American-sponsored anti-Iran alliance, also known as the Abraham Accords. So this is a broad kind of overview to set a broad geopolitical context, to set the strong emotions, the strong empathy people feel for the war in Gaza in some cold-blooded geopolitical context. And I think if you're going to understand the Middle East, you need to keep your feet firmly on the ground. It's all right to have a sympathy one way or the other, but when you analyze things, you have to look not at the emotions, but the interests. And you have to look at how the governments calculate their interests, which are not necessarily the same way as how the people empathize with various issues. Well, once again, thank you all for giving our evening to listen to Dr. Clemens J. and now Clem.
Thank you very much, Chairman. It has always been a treat for me to listen to Chairman, even in my much younger days. And of course, Chairman, we are always forever 25, so that's fine, right? So, Chairman has never failed to tickle my mind in a lot of things. And thank you so much for the very broad, comprehensive, insightful overview of the region. I think what Chairman has done is very important because it sets the stage of what is to come. And we have a very exciting series going on. But without further ado, let me also invite now on stage Professor Ting Ting, Dean of School of Business, SUSS, to give a welcome remark.
Okay, thank you, Stephen. Good afternoon, everyone. I have to declare that my knowledge about Middle East is very limited, so I'll keep my remark very short. First of all, I would like to warmly welcome everyone to this important lecture series, Navigating the New Middle East Landscape, jointly organized by SUSS DBAC, SUSS School of Business, and NUS Middle East Institute. I would like to extend a special acknowledgement to Professor Robbie Goh and Mr. Bilahari Kausikan. Your presence highlights the significance of this discussion today. I would also like to express my sincere gratitude to the organizing committee, our DBAC members, especially Dr. Stephen Ho, Dr. Janet Liu, and Mr. Chen Ziwen for their hard work and generous sponsorship in making this event possible. So at the SUSS School of Business, we are committed to providing students with knowledge and skills needed to navigate global markets. And we ensure that our curriculum reflects the complexity of regions like the Middle East, preparing our students to lead in the diverse and interconnected world. And nowadays, cross-cultural competence is even more important than ever in today's global economy. So this lecture series provides a unique opportunity to deepen our understanding of different cultural and business practices, which is essential for effective leadership. I'm also going to sit through all the 6 sessions to learn about Middle East, as I also lack knowledge in this field. So we are honored to have speakers like Mr. Bilahari Kausikan and Dr. Clemens Che with us today, whose expertise will greatly enrich our discussion. And looking at the setting of the room, I'm sure this will be a very interactive session. And please feel free to ask questions, share insights, and make the most of this opportunity. Let's all commit to make this series, this lecture series, not just a learning journey, but also a collaborative exchange of ideas. So thank you once again for coming. And now may I have the honor to invite Dr. Clemens Che to start the very first opening session of this lecture series.
Thank you, Dean, for the welcome remarks. Now, maybe let me do a quick introduction of Dr. Clemens Che. Dr. Che is a research fellow at the NUS MEI, Middle East Institute. His research focuses on the history and politics of the Gulf states, with a particular emphasis on Kuwait, Oman, Qatar. At MEI, he spearheads a public education series entitled Bridging the Gulf. He's a highly sought after writer, and he's always constantly being featured in the media, and most recently on CNA and so on and so forth. So he's a highly sought after speaker. So without further ado, I shall pass the time to Dr. Clemens Che to kick off the first lecture in this 6 lecture series.
So good evening, everybody, and thanks for being here. Of course, we have 6 sessions in total for this ME 101 series. So my job is to pick your interest sufficiently to make you come back for the remaining 5 sessions, and our chairman will deliver the closing at the end of the series. So I have my set of notes here, but I think I'm going to wing it because I think some of the statistics are already on the slides, so it's free for everybody to take a look. So let me start by saying that the presentation today will be divided into 3 major parts. First, because we are talking about the transformations of the economies of the Gulf, we'll start with what potential they have, that comes out of their diversification process and drive. Of course, this entails winning off oil and gas, which has been the long-standing interest in the region. But then, like our chairman said, you can't talk about economic policies without the social reforms. So we need to talk about the social changes that's happening in the region, especially in the Gulf, and I'll explain a little bit more why we are focusing on the Gulf states. We will cover some of the policy changes. We're not too much, but because we will go into detail in some of the sessions on specific sessions. And then we'll come back to talk about the family and the importance of tradition, because that is still something that they are trying to grapple with, because despite all these social reforms, they would like to still retain the national identity, whether it's in the Emirates, Qatar, or Saudi Arabia. So this is particularly important for them, and it's a very localized debate in the Gulf states at the minute. And we also talk a bit, when we talk about the family, we also talk about the circuit, the networks, how they work, and how you should or should not navigate these networks or social networks for business dealings in particular. So I'll start with some stats, and I think you can see from the maps here of the region. You talk about the Middle East, and you have these maps from 23 and this year 24. The Middle East Outlook as produced by the Economies Intelligence Unit, and you see that if you look at the graph or the map on the left, the GDP growth percentage of change, the green being the highest percentage of growth, you can see very clearly that the green areas, and then you compare it with that of 2024, the outlook for 2024, and you still see that the Gulf states are the ones that stand out in terms of GDP growth. So that is one point, but the next point comes to what has happened recently in the last year. Let me see why. So this, obviously, October 7, as we already talked about in the opening remarks, of course, the National Security Advisor of the US actually said about 8 days before October 7 broke out that the Middle East has never been quieter. And of course, it's actually quite the opposite at the minute. But despite October 7, and this is where I like to point out again, and we saw the GDP growth earlier, the oil prices, which, by and large tend to reflect stability in the region. I mean, you look at the prices, they have hovered on the left or right of $80 per barrel. And things have not drastically changed. It's a sanguine response by the oil trading community. And the Gaza war has yet to seriously disrupt the energy markets. So what does that mean? That means that the Gulf states, who are the main oil exporters of the region, still have the money to obviously finance their own economic policies, to for investments and other whole-scale, mega-scale projects. And then we'll see that in the UAE and Saudi Arabia a bit later. Again, going back, GDP per capita, if you look at the Gulf states again, they obviously outstrip the rest of the Middle East in terms of GDP per capita. If you look at the figures on your right of the screen. And if you compare it again with the rest of the Middle East, if you want to differentiate population sizes in various Middle Eastern countries versus the GDP per capita, I think it's quite the opposite. You can see a city like Cairo having a huge population, but if you talk about GDP per capita, it suddenly shrinks in size. And that's quite the opposite for Gulf states such as Qatar and UAE especially, whose national population represents 10% or 10 to 50% of the total population, including the expats. But at the same time, you have a very high GDP per capita for their nationals, among the nationals. Does the future lie in the East? I think last September, we saw the IMEC, the India-Middle Eastern Corridor, being conceived. Of course, this is now put on hold because of the Gaza war. But the point is that, you know, besides the IMEC, you have the BRI, obviously, seeping into the region as well since 2013. And Asian countries, Asian powers are major energy importers. And of course, they are looking at the Gulf states for this to meet their needs and demands. And interestingly, if you look at some of the other exports, they are non-hydrocarbons. You have, for example, Saudi Arabia having about over 1,000 plastic factories, which are then exported to the eventual products, plastic and rubber products, which are eventually exported to China. And so there is a demand in other areas, other products other than hydrocarbons. And the flip side is that Asian countries have also focused on expanding relations with the region. We also see the Gulf states being very proactive in engaging with ASEAN. We've seen the GCC ASEAN summit taking place last October. Whether or not we'll see this inter-regional connection develop is another thing, but bilaterally, if you look at how the Gulf states have engaged countries in ASEAN, for example, if you take the UAE has just recently signed a comprehensive economic partnership agreement with Malaysia. And that comes after, I believe, Cambodia and Indonesia. So they are looking to, to deepen that kind of arrangement in the region. With us in Singapore, it's more targeted. They want to look at, we want to look at really specific areas that we would like to have partnerships with the UAE, for example. Saudi Arabia, another example, case in point, where they've just opened up a new Ministry of Investment office here, and there are discussions to open an office for their sovereign wealth fund, a PIF. Right, when we talk about economic diversification for the Gulf states, it's the move away from oil. And if you look at the slide here, the non-oil sectors that we are talking about, they can be quite creative about it. It goes as far as sport and football. Saudi Arabia, for those football lovers, you know that they have the PIF, the Sovereign Wealth Fund, has invested a huge amount of money in 4 of their local clubs to purchase world-class players to join the SPL, the Saudi Pro League, and to raise the standard. Whether or not this is sustainable, we will see in the medium and long term. But we also saw the success of the Qatar World Cup, and of course the iconic picture of Messi in the bisht, the traditional black garment with gold lining, lifting the World Cup. And of course that has raised the profile and visibility of Qatar. Airlines-wise, I think this was also mentioned. I think aviation diplomacy is where they also have made take a lot of strides. Emirates Airlines and Qatar Airways, especially Qatar Airways being used for humanitarian purposes, for example, evacuation of refugees and so on. We have the Dubai Expo, which also concluded, and despite the being reeling off the COVID-19 period, Dubai Expo also took off, and next one will be Riyadh Expo in 2030. So the football scene, as we just briefly talked about, you can see that the Saudi Sovereign Wealth Fund bought over Newcastle. You have Sheikh Mansour of the UAE, who is the Vice President and Deputy Prime Minister of the UAE, He owns Manchester City. And then you have from Qatar, Nasser Al-Khelaifi, who owns PSG. So the sovereign wealth fund, I think, is, I think you look at the top 15 in the world here, they are among the top 15. Of course, we are also there, as you can see. And of course, that means that there's plenty of areas where they can put their money, plenty of baskets where they can put their money in. I think a bit of background. I think this 2014 clip, an interview was done after Dubai suffered from a financial crisis in 2009. And you may know the famous or not so famous story about the Burj Al Dubai, which you see now, renamed as the Burj Khalifa, because Abu Dhabi came to their rescue. So the context, of course, at that time, he was already thinking forward. He was thinking about the Dubai Expo. And of course, he has planned for it, even though Dubai was already in debt. And I think the debt was only recently paid off. And yet Dubai Expo still had to go on. The show still had to go on. So the whole point being that they were not going to rest on their laurels, and they're going to move forward with whatever Dubai can be as a mega host, a host for mega events. And also, if you look at the current rhetoric that is delivered by the current UAE president, Sheikh Mohammed bin Zayed. Okay, so in this case, it's about acknowledging the role that expats or the foreign population has to play, or foreign expat population in the countries, especially for the UAE and the Qatar, for UAE and Qatar, what they have, the role that they have to play in these countries, because their own national population only consists of 10% of the total population. So there's an acknowledgement, and it's also an acknowledgement when Qatar was undergoing a blockade by its neighbors. And it was also that time when the Qatari emir or ruler came out to say that he had to thank his foreign residents and expat population for standing by them during the whole course of the 4-year blockade, and continuing to provide and render services to the whole population, not just to the nationals, but to everyone in society. So let us take a look now at another interview more recently with Al Arabiya, with the Saudi Crown Prince and Prime Minister Mohammed bin Salman. And this is probably the only interview he has given in English. So back on the right track, and that's what he said. And some of the reforms that we're going to look at entail putting a leash on the religious police, putting a leash on the clerics or the ulama in Saudi Arabia, and promoting a version of moderate Islam, and also declaring that the ultra-conservative version of Islam, what Saudi Arabia has been adhering to for the longest time, Wahhabism, is out of date. So those are some of the reforms that we will take a look a bit later. So it's a tale of visions. If you look at the government websites of the various Gulf states, you realize that they have vision something, vision something, and each Gulf state has its own vision and strategy for the, I would say, the medium term, at least to 2030 to 2040. And in this vision, they aspire to do various things. And the list goes on, but I think this is not the first wave of, I guess you could say, modernization. For Saudi Arabia, certainly is a period of modernization, but the rest of the Gulf states, such as the UAE, for example, has already taken, there was already a first wave back in the 60s and 70s when oil was already discovered, was just discovered, and this oil wealth was being put to use for suburbanization, for rapid urbanization. And this is the case of Kuwait, who was actually one of the pioneers among the Gulf states back then until the Iraqi invasion hit them. So if you look at these few photos, this is Kuwait right now with the various ring roads that you see. This is the master plan in 1952 for Kuwait. There was only aimed to develop only 3 ring roads, but look where they are now. And this actually came after the country was developed from a small port town, and the history of these Gulf states, especially those who are situated, which are situated on the coast, are very similar. They were involved in pearl diving, pearl fishing, shipbuilding, and you would hear a lot of these stories if you are in the region. So they developed from off the coast and inland, and they were developing inwards with their markets, what they call the bazaar, the souk, and then they also traded via caravans and the desert to transport goods. But then, of course, with the discovery of oil, they soon started to develop, and then just prior to independence, they started to develop a master plan. And of course, the rest is history. If you look at Riyadh city, it's about the same, in terms of population density, in terms of how they develop from an urban perspective. I think Stephen would know a bit more because he was, in his past life, he was also involved in this kind of urban planning and city master plans. So you look here and you see Riyadh in the 2000s, quite a huge population and urban density, and this is what they aspire for Expo 2030. A different kind of feel, a more lifestyle destination kind of feel. The actual master plan details have not been released on their government website, but this is part of their promotional video that has been released. What has also been conceived out of Riyadh and out of Saudi Arabia is also their tourist destinations. They have been promoting their visit visa since 2019. It was put on hold because of COVID, of course, but then now it's back in business. And you see that international arrivals to Saudi Arabia is increasing. And if you look at their Vision 2030 target, which is 100 million domestic and international visitors, they have already hit that target. And they are looking to hit further at 150 million international visitors. Some of the destinations here at your bottom right is Diriyah, which is just off Riyadh, and it's the first Saudi capital. I visited it, and it's quite well done with a lot of explanatory notes. It's sort of an open-air museum. And then you have the Red Sea Resort, which is opening this year, I think this month, really. And there you will find that there are plans and debates to allow the sale of alcohol. And so you see the direction that they are moving towards. And finally, on the top left, you have Al-Ula, which is an archaeological site that has been excavated and trying to rival the likes of Petra in Jordan, if you have ever been to Petra. So if you look at all these projects that they have, that means that the construction and transport contract awards are on a high at the minute. And the EIU, of course, said that the largest construction projects market in the Gulf belong to Saudi Arabia for 2022. And that surpasses other giant markets such as even the capital in Abu Dhabi and Dubai. So infrastructure spending, of course, Saudi Arabia is not alone there. Yes, we talked about the World Cup earlier, and Qatar spent a record amount of money compared to previous World Cup hosts in terms of their infrastructure, because they had to build stadiums, they had to build roads, they had to build the metro. I'm not sure if you already tried the metro, but there were a few of my Singaporean friends who said they'd never been to Doha, and when they went there, they were pleasantly surprised by the metro, which is very similar to ours. But they do have a golden carriage in their metro. You might want to take a look if you ever visit Doha. Of course, then the question is, can this kind of infrastructure be sustained without visitors after the World Cup? And so the IMF has produced a report, and in the report it says that there's a boost in global visibility for Qatar, and the number of visitors, of course, does not match the World Cup period, but then at the same time it's still at a high level. So we come to the reforms. We talk about economic policies. These have to be accompanied by social reforms, because this means that you have a more attractive business environment, social environment, and a place to live, especially for expats. And this is Olaya Street in Riyadh, where I was last November. And you see that the ladies are out in their abaya, and you might not think much of it. But the truth is that there was, prior to the social reforms, a male guardianship system where ladies have to be accompanied by their male family member, or even given permission to move around. But the reforms in Saudi Arabia that is probably about 5 years ago, 2019, to the male guardianship system in particular, have given women more freedom to move and to work as well. And this is, you might not think much of it, but in the localized context, is revolutionary. And some of the ladies that I spoke to in a professional setting during the visit said that they are able to work travel between cities to work, and that's quite a novelty. But also the right to own passport, which you think might be a basic right to have. But the latest is, of course, the sale of alcohol that I mentioned, and now it's started in Riyadh's diplomatic quarter for non-Muslim foreign diplomats, and there are expectations that this will expand. The prohibition of gender discrimination in employment means that women now get to enter the workforce and become a valuable asset for the Saudi economy, and that again is a target where Saudi Arabia has hit in terms of their vision 2030. It exceeded the target of 30% of females in the workforce, and now is now at 36%. You'll be also surprised that there is an entertainment city in the mix of their projects called Qiddiya, and Qiddiya is one of them. But you also, if you did not know about this, K-pop has also been to Saudi Arabia in Jeddah in 2022. Last year it was there at what they call K-Con. You know, you have Comic Con for those who read comics, but then there's the Korean Con, K-Con, last year 2023, where the K-pop bands were also performing in Saudi Arabia. Because we talked about how the religious clerics have been reigning in Saudi Arabia, and interestingly also the malls, the end of segregation in malls and restaurants. Interesting, there was one mall that I visited where someone said that there was a partition here, one side for males, one side for females, and you could only look through the glass panel to see the opposite sex. But this is no longer there. For the UAE, of course, it has been more progressive. They have already been there, done that. But the latest slew of reforms from 2019, you know, has put them further ahead of in terms of the competition, if you like. So you have cohabitation being permitted for unmarried couples. You have the, alcohol consumption is no longer a criminal offense, and divorce follows the laws of the country where the marriage took place, and penalties for honor crimes against women, golden visas, and I think the granting of citizenship to foreigners. I think that is the biggest one because it's the first in the region. But then again, this sparked a national debate on national identity versus citizenship, because if you grant citizenship to a foreigner, would that person still uphold Emirati traditions? Would that person still understand the know-how of behaving like an Emirati? Those were the concerns that were debated locally and especially in government. Now, going back to the family, and I think we talked about tradition. So the family, I think it must be said that these reforms and policies operate on a top-down basis, meaning we talked about monarchies. Monarchies, obviously, there's a ruling family, and in each of the Gulf states, there is a different ruling family in charge. And of course, they like to say that the policies being rolled out are part of enlightened autocracy, if you like. So these are the ruling families of the UAE. I think we are the most familiar with Dubai and Abu Dhabi, but there are 7 emirates in the UAE's federation, and each emirate has a different ruler. We can come to, during the Q&A, we can come to talk about the potential or existing contributions by the other emirates besides Dubai and Abu Dhabi. Now, because they operate on a top-down fashion, they do have national assemblies or a representative council in their domestic politics, but you realize that these are mostly consultative or advisory, meaning that your parliament or your elected institution is the things that come out of there are not binding. You can only give advice. Of course, the only exception in the Gulf is Kuwait, but then Kuwait suspended its parliament not long ago, and they have suspended for 4 years. So that means that if you look at the region, the Gulf region, it means that it's really monarchies. Now we come back to the family, and I want to bring it down to the societal level, where if you ask a lot of nationals in the Gulf, they will tell you about the last 3 feet, meaning FaceTime. Not FaceTime on your iPhone, but FaceTime meaning face-to-face communication, which matters a lot in the region. They like to see, they like to communicate with you in person. They like to see the same face returning, especially when you're doing business. and they do not really fancy too much of a change of faces each time a contract has to be signed. So I think at MEI we also have our little red book, not the little red book that you think of, but it's called Pitching a Tent. I think Sharon or Peggy has it. You can pick it up, which also gives some tips on business dealings and how to conduct business dealings in the region. But if you look at the family, and coming back here, this year, I think we talked about all the economic policies in the region. Dubai has set a social agenda. Family is the theme for this year. And you realize that after all that debate, localized debate on national identity versus citizenship, they have now come back looking inwards and looking at the family. What can they do to encourage more nationals to get married, to the preservation of tradition, the know-how of being an Emirati, their family lineage. Sometimes they carry these little books of their family lineage to schools for their students. So there is a sense of coming back and looking at the social fabric. Now we talk about economic diversification. We talk about the various, so-called liberal policies, but this can only go so far. There are limits because number one, we talked about the preservation of tradition. And then the other point is about the foreigner or the expat. There is a term in academia called ethnocracy, meaning that even among the expat population, there is a hierarchy or implicit hierarchy where perhaps the white Western expat is at the top of this hierarchy and the domestic worker is at the bottom. Of course, these are not said. These things are not said out in the open in the Gulf states, but in your interactions, your social interactions, day-to-day social interactions, you will realize that there is this ethnocracy, number one, and also the fact that the foreigner is seen as a transient segment of the population, meaning that they finish their contract, they leave. So they will not be staying and servicing that particular sector for life. And finally, the point on navigating the family circuit, which I mentioned earlier, that is quite important because to understand the various families in a specific country would also give you an understanding of the power or the capital that the family wields. So lineage, intermarriages, these are the things that you have to navigate when you are in these Gulf states. One example is, I just put it here in Qatar, Mira Atiyah. She's the CEO of Qatar National Bank Capital. And now, despite all her professional achievements and this, of course, no discrediting to achievements, but if you look at the family, going back to the family charts, and I must say that these charts also are a form of business. People actually do up these charts and sell them. And for people who want to know the family lineage, to trace this family lineage and political affiliations and interfamily connectedness. So Mira comes from the Al Ibrahim branch, which is also tied to the Al Thani ruling family of Qatar. And that means the political capital wielded by this branch of the family or this family, the tree of Atiyah, is considerable. So if you look at some of the families, for example, in another Gulf country such as Kuwait, you realize that the tribal branches have been there for a very long time, even in the pre-oil era, when at that time there were intermarriages between members of the ruling family with the daughters of tribal sheikhs to cement this kind of partnership, and also at that time for defense and security purposes. So these families become the security provider for the ruling family back in the day. Of course, these in modern times are being translated into the local police force or the National Guard, for example. Now to conclude, so we've said that economic policies must run in tandem with the social changes in the Gulf, because only by changing the social environment can you attract professional talent and can you bring in the tourists as well. So the objective is really not solely about profits. It's about profiling. Global visibility is something we talked about. But it's also about patriotism, especially in Saudi Arabia when you have a huge youth population and they are looking at what their leadership is doing, and they're feeling that the leadership is listening to what they want, to what they desire, and they're making the necessary changes. But then, because Saudi Arabia is the giant that awakens, and we will cover that in a later session as part of the series, the concern has also been whether society can keep up, because Saudi Arabia is changing at a much faster pace than the UAE did over 10 or 20 years. Again, change does not happen overnight. You saw the relaxation of male guardianship laws, but then the women are still pretty much covered up from head to toe on the streets, despite being able to walk around independently and freely. And emphasis still remains on the family unit, which has already undergone a rapid upheaval during the urbanization and the discovery of oil period. And there is also now an intent by the governments to look inwards, to look at social policies and the preservation of tradition. And finally, of course, is to stay productive with a youthful population in the global economy, and to encourage youth to take up unconventional jobs, vocational training. And also, I think the biggest point and the big challenge for the Gulf states is to teach them how to fish rather than fishing for them. So with that, I end my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Clemens. All of you would join me to thank Dr. Che again for his very interesting and comprehensive overview of the Middle East. More round of applause. Right, so we have come to the Q&A session, but actually it's meant to be a discussion. So if there are any questions that you might have, feel free to take this opportunity to ask any questions, burning questions that you might have. But before that, maybe just a few quick remarks. It is very exciting and interesting to hear about the social reforms that you mentioned about, because I clearly remember when I was in the Middle East, I had a great privilege of attending a wedding. I was invited to a wedding, and throughout the whole wedding, I did not even get the chance to see the bride once. Because the whole time I was amongst the male friends of mine, and we were dancing the whole night through. And I was asking privately, at which point do we get to see the bride? And then he says, not today. But I'm here to attend the wedding. Yes, you are. And where's the bride? Oh, they are in the other hall. Can I go take a look? No. You'll be in serious trouble, my friend, if you do. I say, okay. So I spent the whole night dancing with my friends. And it was quite an interesting experience. So I'm glad to see that now, even in restaurants, you don't have to. I remember those very clearly. You go to restaurants, it's kind of interesting. There's this huge divider. And on one side, the ladies, on the other side are the guys. But interestingly, there's also one section for families where they can eat together. Okay, anyway, enough for me talking. Any immediate questions that anybody would like to pose? And with your permission, Chairman, Provost, and Dean, maybe they can even direct the questions to you. Okay, so this is a rare opportunity. Maybe a quick word about Chairman. He used to be a diplomat, and he has traveled around the world, and he has very interesting insights about foreign policies. So even maybe beyond the Middle East. Okay. Any first question, comments?
First of all, thank you very much for the very insightful talk. Question is around Qatar. I might not be within the specialty, but you mentioned one of the big focuses of the Gulf is focusing on one huge event like the World Cup. And I was wondering if you have any thoughts what Qatar would look like now that the World Cup is over. What are their strategies, or how can they kind of, I guess, attract more short-term visitors for tourists to kind of justify the investment in infrastructure, or maybe long-term visitors, people are looking to kind of establish their career. So yeah, commentary around that.
Thanks for your question. So you may or may not know about the blockade of Qatar from 2017-21. And that sped up, besides the World Cup, that of course hastened the infrastructure building process. The blockade actually also pushed them in that direction, quicker in that direction. And they have their own food security sorted. Well, not fully, but the level of food security has increased. They have their own dairy products right now in Qatar. And similar to the UAE, they have very similar strategies in bringing expats in. But if you talk about tourism, they would have to go beyond Doha, meaning that Doha is the only developed, I guess you could say, city in Qatar, and there are many other areas that should still be developed other than Doha. Right now, there are mainly residential districts, and some of them are reserved for nationals. And the Qatari government actually redistributes this kind of lands to specific families to develop their own villas and all that. But some of these areas will be developed as potential tourism attraction areas as well.
Thank you, Dr. Che. You talked about that transition from the oil and gas industries into other, I guess, projects, and people can argue some vanity projects that are not very profitable. My question to you is, what are your thoughts if the oil and gas industry starts to, say, slow down or there's going to be losses? Obviously, it's somewhat subsidizing some of these projects that are going on. Do you see that change actually slows down in a situation like that? What are your thoughts? Are we in a point where the transition is already at a stage where it's never going back, or just will be dependent upon how profitable the old industries are?
Yeah, thank you for your question. Well, the oil and gas industry, normally I would like to defer it to my colleague Aisha, who will be covering this in her session, I think the 5th session of the series. But I would say that, based on a report delivered by the Chief Middle East Economist of Bloomberg, Ziad Dawood, I think he just posted about it just yesterday. He said that for Saudi Arabia to actually finance this project, it requires $92 per barrel. And right now, it's obviously falling short of that 92 per barrel, which means there will be a deficit. And if you take into account other investments, it will need $110 or $112 to actually complete or its investments in other mega projects. But what I can say is that at the minute, Saudi Arabia has taken voluntary oil production cuts. And if these are removed, then obviously they will probably narrow that gap between the current price, or hovering around 80, to the 90 that I talked about. So they are expected to do away with these production cuts, but I think I will leave that question to my colleague at a later stage for session 5, I think.
Well, thank you, Clemens, for interesting presentation. The Gulf society, like the majority of the society are the youth. They constitute, I think, more than 25% or more of the society. So what are the targeted reforms that target the youth population in the Gulf, if you can speak about that?
Well, the reforms, I think, at the minute, I would say that, the largest youth population in the region is obviously Saudi Arabia. And we looked at some of these projects earlier, especially for sport. And developing the SPL, for example, is going to develop a football ecosystem that is expected to bring in more jobs for the youth. And if you travel around the Gulf and you take an Uber, for example, or a taxi, you realize that only in Saudi Arabia, or perhaps sometimes in Oman, you encounter a local taxi driver. But in Saudi Arabia, most times when you call for an Uber, the driver is a Saudi. And I think that says a lot, that there is a move to shift mindsets on the ground, to say that no job is beneath you. And that is quite a crucial thing for the Gulf states and their youth populations, to say that, you should be willing to take up these jobs. Yeah. And of course, educational reforms, I think that has been on the cards for a long time now. And I think only recently have they started looking away from Western academy and looking towards Asia. So that's something that I think countries in this region should tap.
Thank you for your talk. I was just wondering, when you talked about social reforms and all of it loosening up, to what extent is it more about looking desirable to Western markets compared to maybe more of an intrinsic idea of, yeah, actually, let's loosen up and let's actually give more rights to women?
Looking more appealing to Western markets. Well, I think entertainment is one industry. I think if you look at the PIF, in 2018, they invested in a Hollywood talent scouting agency called Endeavor. And I think they are not, obviously the focus earlier was on Asian economies and the Look East kind of initiative. But I think the whole point about talking about looking east is because traditionally they have been looking at the West, and education is one of them. They've Gulf students have traditionally gone to the West to study, whether it's to the US or to the UK or even Europe. And in fact, London is one of their favorite destinations. If you walk around Knightsbridge in London, you'll find a lot of them strolling on the streets. So I think the shift is right now I think comes on two levels. The first level is the government level, where they are looking to play a hedging game between the West and the East. And I think if you look at the Russia-Ukraine war, the Gulf states, they abstained and in the first vote. And if you look at the population level, there is an increasing, there is this mindset that says that we should look towards the East especially for educational purposes, and Singapore is one of them. Singapore has always been a role model or a brand name, if you like, for the Gulf states to model themselves and to measure themselves against us, and especially our multicultural model, which is now being, I wouldn't say embraced, but I think it's being adopted in one way or another by the UAE, which has the Abrahamic house, if it's called that, where they have three places of worship in one compound. So there are, of course, pull factors from both sides, I think. Yeah.
This empowerment of women, is it an end? To what extent is it an end in itself, or to what extent is it an instrument to make the place a more desirable place for Western businesses to operate? I think that was the real point of it.
Okay. So if we're talking about the empowerment of women, I think to be blunt, of course, empowerment of women is one way of showing the West that they're doing something. And that is not just that. I think it's one in the series of reforms that they have rolled out to show that the West that they're doing something. And this runs alongside the whole agenda on human rights that of course President Biden made a hoo-ha during his presidential campaign before he took the seat. And of course, this is obviously cosmetic in some ways. And if you go down to the ground and ask women, I think they said that things have changed, but not quite. I think that's as far as it goes.
Based on what you have said, right? Well, I think, would there be any chance of gender equality ever? And if you were to foresee this happening, what is the time frame that you're looking at? Because they're largely based on religious, let's say, guidance in terms of how they operate. And then when you say that there is a liberation in terms of some of the function that will be given to the female gender itself, will you ever see a gender equality in that region?
So gender equality, I think we've talked about this. Well, I bet the Gulf states have talked about this since their inception, since their independence. In fact, there has been shifts, there has been positive and progressive movements, but I think we are going to wait a long time before we're going to see gender equality. Chairman might have something to add. I think he looks like he has something to add. And I think maybe Aisha, you might also say something. You are someone from the region.
Maybe let me just ask something which may be a little bit unfair or not very good. Is that I still don't think it is possible to do business in the Gulf state if you do not know an Al Khalifa or Al Saud or Al Sayed. How, to what extent this is true, because that seems to be the practice that we have or the experience that we have.
Well, firstly, I think based on the history of these families, Al Khalifa, Al Thani belong to the political leadership. And to penetrate the business circuit, requires you to know the families who are in that merchant or business or commercial circuit. which means not necessarily at the top echelon of that society, but somewhere in the middle where they are also have ties with the top political echelons, but they are mainly merchant families, especially in history. So you will need to know and understand which families are doing what kind of business. And for example, I'll give you an example in Kuwait, where you have this family that originated from Iran called the Bebehani family. Specific families are given distributorship or dealership of brands. For example, the watch Omega. In Kuwait, you'll find this Bebehani family in charge of being given the distributorship of Omega. So you need to be able to pinpoint and identify the family that runs that particular business that you are interested in.
You probably have time for 2 more questions. Anyone?
Hi, thank you very much for your sharing. So you've talked a little bit about this Gulf states and the Middle East in general liberalizing, and I think the texture of this liberalization is quite Western in nature. At the same time, we have China, who is trying to play a bigger role in the Middle East. First with the rapprochement between KSA and Iran, and with greater investments into the region. So how do you think the landscape of the Middle East, or the Gulf states specifically, will look as China increases its footprint in the region, politically, socially? I reckon this is a very broad question, but we've talked about the West. So what about Chinese influence?
Yeah, I think that question was bound to come. So China's economic footprint has been growing in the region. But the real question is whether they are willing to wield or exercise the political capital to put their hand in where the US have traditionally been putting their hand in. And I think Chairman will have more to say about this. But if you just look at the war in Gaza, I think we saw very recently the Beijing Declaration, where China has supposedly brought together the 14 Palestinian factions and signed an agreement that they will work together. But we know that there is a deep-seated mistrust between the 2 main factions, which is Hamas and Fatah. If you look back even further, we had the Saudi-Iran deal that you mentioned. But that deal, much of the legwork of that one was done by the Omanis. And so if you ask about China's economic footprint, yes, is there. I think the question is whether they would be willing to deploy security to protect this as economic assets that they have in the region, as what the US has been traditionally the security guarantor of the region. Chairman, I think he has something to add.
I think China's, as Clem said, China plays a very important economic role. It will play a bigger economic role. But so far, its diplomatic, strategic, political role is really what I call performance diplomacy. As Clemens mentioned, the Saudi-Iran deal to restore diplomatic relations, the groundwork was really done by Oman. They worked at it for 2 years. It is only the final act that the Saudis and the Omani and the Iranians decided to perform in Beijing. And why they decided to perform in Beijing, I think, is very indicative. That deal was announced on the 10th of March. On the 9th of March, there was a leak from Saudis to the Wall Street Journal saying that they are prepared to join the Abraham Accord under certain conditions. Security guarantee against Iran from the US, and a nuclear deal with the US. In other words, they did it in Beijing to try to get some leverage over the US. For Iran, I think it's obvious. They got nowhere else to do it except Beijing. They got no friends in the region, all right? So I think, and even that deal between the Palestinian factions, I don't know anybody in the region who took it seriously. It's performance diplomacy. In the long run, China, although it's very reluctant, will have to play a bigger strategic role. Whether they can or not is another issue. That's because China is still extremely dependent on Middle East energy and will be for quite some time to come. However, the energy routes from the Middle East to China are protected by who? They're protected by the American Fifth Fleet and the Seventh Fleet. That is intolerable for any major power to allow your energy to be protected by your major rival. So they will have to play a strategic role, but I think they are going to be extremely reluctant to do it because there is no major power that has gone to the Middle East to play a strategic role and has not gone into trouble. But we will see. There are certain innate contradictions in the Chinese approach to the Middle East from a strategic point of view. Right now, they are able to have reasonable relations with Saudi Arabia, Israel, and with Iran. This is not sustainable over the long run, right? And the tensions of the Gaza war, where they have refused to condemn Hamas attack on Israel, has brought those tensions to the surface, and I think damaged their position somewhat. Not that anybody is going to refuse to deal with China. Of course, you have to, right? But as an economic partner, as far as strategic is concerned, there is only one major power in the Middle East still, the US. It's a reluctant power, but it's only the US can maintain what little stability the Middle East is capable of having.
All right, okay, maybe I'll do the honor of asking the last question. So I think much has been said, thanks to Chairman and yourself, about the Middle East. Now, I think a lot of us are from the business community in Singapore. And of course, Singapore companies have been venturing into the Middle East for the longest time, at least for the last 25 years. With these changes in the economic, geopolitical scene, as well as the social reform that's happening, what do you think are some advice you would give to Singapore companies trying to make new or enhance inroads into the Middle East?
Our Gulf friends would like to say, especially the Saudis, say, come. But I think you need to do your homework before you need to do your homework regardless before you go anywhere. We've seen that there's also the complex family networks that are present over there. Some countries are easier to do business than others. DIFC, Dubai International Financial Center, is obviously established. It's much easier. They have procedures in place for you to do business. But a country like Saudi Arabia is still finding its feet. I mean, they are keen, eager, but they are still finding its feet in terms of setting the right rules, setting up the regulatory agency, and these things take time, right? And I said change doesn't happen overnight. So advice number one is to do your homework and find out which sectors, I guess, are the most advanced. I think tourism is the one that is booming at the minute for Saudi Arabia, whether it's religious tourism or domestic tourism, and of course attracting international visitors into Saudi Arabia. There are mega projects where there are roles to be played by externals, and we saw the Red Sea resort, we saw Diriyah, we saw Al-Ula. These are areas where they have already engaged foreign consultants to help them out. So that is one, and I think Singapore is also helping them with their port terminals at King Abdulaziz port, running the logistics for those. So I think we need to be able to pinpoint and also find out from our counterparts over there which areas that they need help with. I think they are now more eager to engage with this part of the world, and this is the time to ask our questions. What do you need? I think, yeah.
Okay, thank you very much. So once again, please put our hands together to thank Dr. Clemens Chey, Chairman. Now it leaves me now to make a little bit of, I'm quite sure all of us agree that this has been a very insightful session. And I'd like to assure you there are more to come. There's 5 more sessions, and I'll very quickly share with you what those 5 sessions are. The next session will be specifically about the UAE and entitled Paddling Faster Ahead of the Gulf Pact. So the question is the UAE really ahead of the game? And in session 3, Saudi Arabia, a giant awakened. Very interesting topic. Session number 4, Israel, startup nation longing for. Session number 5, renewable energy sources preempting a sunset oil industry. I think this has been an ongoing issue for quite a lot of years. And session number 6, where Chairman will be doing his sharing, is the mirage of stability in the Middle East. I think much has been said. And now it leaves me now to once again thank our distinguished guest, Professor Goh, Mr. Bilahari Kausikan, Professor Ting, and of course Clemens for this very exciting start to this ME101 event.